G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Continuing on with my attempt at a chronological recounting of the events of the Battle of the Coral Sea 79 years ago, as affecting 11 and 20 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force operating Catalinas. Using information drawn from Jack Riddell's book. Those of you familiar with events may realise that the 6th of May was when the aircraft carriers were sort of desperately sniffing around and starting to come into contact with each other. From what I can make of it, this is Task Force 17, Admiral Fletcher, 3rd of May, 4th of May, 5th of May, 6th of May. Task Force 11 with Finch and Task Force 14 with Crace. Up here you have the Neosho sinking from a Japanese attack, and the Japanese, they are 5th of May, I think that's 6th of May, so that's roughly where the Japanese were. These are very old faded maps. I'm shooting this at night on the 5th because I've suddenly realised I've got to take my aged mother to Tamworth tomorrow. So yeah, I'm having a crack at shooting 2 videos in one day. The 5th of May is uploading now and I'm shooting the 6th of May, which I will post tomorrow afternoon when I get back from Tamworth. So, reading from the unit history sheet, details of operations and the operations record book. Commencing from Port Moresby, a reconnaissance of an area bounded by lines joining the positions 11 degrees 20 minutes south, 160 degrees 30 minutes east, which boils down to being just slightly north of Deboyne Island. 13 degrees 50 minutes south, 159 degrees 30 minutes east. Clear over to 11 degrees 50 minutes south, 145 degrees east. If that's not a misprint, and I think it probably is, because if that final figure was 155 degrees east rather than 145 degrees east, then we have two sides of a triangle, or maybe three sides, two sides of a rectangle, which is within operational range of a Catalina, particularly when given that the 4th position on the search area is 09 degrees 20 minutes south, 155 degrees east. And while it's perfectly feasible for a Catalina to fly out from Port Moresby, reach here, and then start doing zigzag search patterns and then fly back home, it's not really possible to come out to here and then route over across to there and then back. And that is an erroneous figure. Even though it does appear in the documents I have to hand. That makes sense. Reconnaissance was undertaken by Catalina aircraft A24-12, Captain Sergeant Miller, Second Pilot Sergeant A. Lunnan, and A24-20, Captain Squadron Leader G. Hemsworth, A24-20 Second Pilot Sergeant J. Coulter of 20 Squadron. Owing to engine trouble, A24-12 failed to take off with a full load, finally took off at 05:30 hours local, after 2 returns to moorings, dumping 300 gallons of fuel at each time, 7.5 pounds per gallon, about a tonne of fuel each time, and replacing the bottom spark plugs for the final attempt. Arrived at Cairns at 12:10 hours local and worked on engines all afternoon. So, A24-12 didn't actually go out there. A24-12 After having got the engines going well enough to get off the water at Port Moresby with sufficient fuel to get somewhere with a decent maintenance base, they went to Cairns. Meanwhile, A24-20 was airborne at 0300 hours local time. At 1422 hours local, a message was received reporting a sighting of two destroyers 4 miles and 10 miles distance, position 10 degrees 40 minutes south, 152 degrees 20 minutes east, which I make to be just about there. Reporting sighting of two destroyers 4 miles and 10 miles distance, positions 10 degrees 40 minutes south, excuse me, 10 degrees 40 minutes south, and not 9 degrees 20 minutes south. So that's the position. And the message was interrupted, stating he was being attacked by enemy aircraft. No further contact was made with A24-20 and the aircraft was missing. Flying time for A24-12 was 6 hours 40 minutes, the original takeoff time of 0300 local. Well, the original flying time, takeoff time of 0300 local, that actually became 0530 after they changed the spark plugs and dumped a whole lot of fuel. But the upshot is that A24-20 has been shot down by enemy aircraft. Very close to Milne Bay, actually. So that's the story of the aircraft operations for the day from Port Moresby. Now we have A24-17 departing from Cairns, which is there. Captain Sergeant C.W. Miller and Second Pilot Sergeant A. Lunnon with their crew took over A24-17 for the night from Squadron Leader F.B. Chapman. Airborne Cairns at 1900 hours local and waterborne Cairns next morning at 10 hours local. Area searched Missima, which is that island there, and surrounds, no sightings. Flying time 15 hours. And that is the best I can make out of that and that, which were the entries for the day. And because the 6th of May was the day the aircraft carriers started sniffing each other's bottoms, we might as well have another letter reading to convey some flavour of the times. From Terry Duigan. Although a qualified Catalina captain, flew as a second pilot on A24-18 and A24-20 with Dick Atkinson as captain. You'll note that A24-18 and A24-20 are two of the Catalinas which were lost on operations. Both times the aircraft had flown 15-16 hours, come back, the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator were replaced, and everybody else had to go out again after no break or downtime because they had to refuel the aircraft. Dear Jack, at last I'm about to contribute my mite to your opus. Very little germane to what you're doing. I haven't even got the number of the aircraft Dick and I were cavorting about in during the period under review. However, I'll vouchsafe a few sidelights as make weight. My log is rather less than bare minimum, I fear, and only a shaky memory applied to the dates recalls something of the actual goings-on. This was written in 1987, by the way. I'm including a couple of pages previous to May the 1st because they include trips with the first fortresses to arrive in Australia. Bracket, they were the mob who bombed the Royal Australian Naval Squadron during Coral Sea, close bracket, and also rescue flights for Yank B-26s, bracket, not to mention a trip in one when several times I conceived my last hours had come, close bracket. With the forts immediately after the Nips had taken Ley and Salamua, I was navigator, second Dick, and waist gunner by turns. On the first outward leg to that target, we flew over Task Force ? The Coral Sea team, I imagine, in brackets, in a great state of disarray, carriers going in circles and so on. So liaison seemed to be about par for the time, but the sight was a great leg up for this boy from the bush. I don't recall that we did any damage to speak of, though the departing carrier strike had one large ship ashore and on fire, and another couple a bit battered. I feel there were zeros about, and remember my pleased surprise as navigator to find our ground speed retreating was 320 miles per hour at 33,000 feet. The next time round they were up with us as we finished our bombing run. As waist gunner, I drew a delicate bead past the pilot of our lead aircraft on a Zeke flying brazenly alongside. Bracket, no doubt out of range, he looked quite near to me. But my weapon wouldn't go off. I hadn't cocked it. When this omission was recognised, my wrist was too limp with the cold to function, but our leader kept his head. B-26 trips were good things to avoid. On the 6th of April, with Johnny Miles, Jim Cowan, Jack Dewhurst, Vic Knowles and others, we picked up the crew of one, shot up over Rabaul and down in the drink off the north coast of the Trobriands, including Squadron Leader Price. And on the 3rd of May, with Dick Atkinson, the crew of another which went over on its back, forced landing on the same island, killing Bob Gurney and the American captain. Murray Brown was intensely annoyed because I said at that time we hadn't been issued with navigators. In fact, Jim Cowan was on the other trip, but he was our first. After the Tommy Price episode, I had a decent dose of dengue by the time we got a layoff at Tulagi, and managed to bend A24-21, dispersing to Malaita. This was perhaps a blessing in disguise because we had a full load of fuel and bombs, and with no wind may never have got out of the rather restricted lagoon we'd chosen for our day off. Anyhow, in our crumpled condition, we perforce offloaded most of the juice, bracket, much appreciated by the local missionaries, close bracket, staggered back to Tulagi, refueled, and were back in RAAF mines in time for Jim to welcome his firstborn into the world. Having had a couple of elective home berths, I just can't imagine flying operationally in a Catalina out over the Coral Sea and then coming home to catch a baby. On the 3rd of May, our B-26 rescue trip, we found the crew on a well-protected bit of the south coast, but Dick managed to stave in the starboard blister, water looping to avoid running up on the beach, bracket, assisted by my insubordinate left foot. On the 5th of May, we were airborne in the small hours and by daylight were down about Rossel Island. We would have had tracks to search, but I have no memory of them. In the light of the larger picture, we now know the Cats would have had the job of giving early warning of the invasion force south of Woodlark, and the Float Fighters just installed on Deboyne would have been there to stop them doing so. If the higher-ups in Moresby had any clue about what was impending, they never filtered down to me. By mid-morning, we were somewhere north of Messina, below Broken Cloud, down to 700 or 800 feet, when found a fine fat ship steaming north. Hindsight makes this the seaplane tender returning from its mission to Deboyne. With a shored cloud cover, we had a good snoop around it, and I think I remember Dick's sighting report correctly identifying it as a seaplane tender, which was very clever. To me, it was a 10,000-ton cargo liner, though its derricks seemed a bit exaggerated. Fairly soon after this, the wireless air gunner came up with an intercept from Norm Fader, A24-12, in plain language I imagine, in brackets, being attacked over Pocklington Reef, and Murray Brown, under interrogation, gave our position as Pocklington Reef. Then there was a bit of confused chat from the blisters, bracket. You'll remember the radio telephone was never worth a cupful in the early Cats, close bracket. and I slid open my window and looked back into a forest of radial engines. Dick had a quick look and showed his heart was in the right place by going straight up into the cloud at 52. Later, the blister team, who'd had a calmer survey, bracket, they hadn't known of Norm F's message, close bracket, reported that the fighter swarm had in fact been a Kawanishi passing by, apparently without hostile intent. What Norm's experience had been, I never did get to hear. From then on, we pottered about with further affrights until lunch and were home in Moresby by late afternoon, oblivious of having briefly tiptoed around the margins of history. Gough Hemsworth and the crew came aboard as the fuelling barge hooked on. I think Al Norman took over Norm Fader's aircraft about the same time, and he and Gough both went missing the next day, without any messages as far as I remember. I only found out by reading it in a book a while ago that Gough flew out from England in the Centenary Air Race with Ray Parra, and thus had been flying a lot longer than most of us sprogs. What I remember him best for was an earlier incident when Hinchcliffe and I brought A24-18 down to Rathmines after it had a replacement tail fitted under the cover of a coconut plantation on the north of Moresby Harbour. We had kept track of the load up to about 3,000 pounds overweight and then stopped counting. Gough was one of the passengers, and we'd been rebuilt, were grossly overloaded, and the night was as black as the inside of a cow. He happily appropriated a bunk and appeared to snore off. I wasn't really surprised when we ran past the last flare, still waterborne, but in between going on to instruments, managed a quick look at the boost and found Hinch had us set on 37 inches. Through the gate and a couple of bumps out to sea and we were away. But Gough said later he'd been keeping an eye on the time and was beginning to regret his misspent youth. I haven't thought about this for years. No doubt some of it's wrong. Reminiscences once started, take some stopping. Hope all goes well. Terry Duigan. Reminiscences once started, take some stopping. That's code for this old bastard's going to get drunk tonight. And I would too, if I could, but I can't because I've given up the booze a couple of months ago and I think I'm going to stay off it for quite a while. So I won't. I'll suck on some ginger beer instead. Right, there you go. 2 episodes recorded in one day. The 5th is already uploaded. The 6th is ready to upload tomorrow when Warbles on a Lot gets back from Tamworth. And by the look of this, it really only goes up to the 11th of May, not the 13th of May. I have no idea what that erroneous 3 is in that figure there. So we're over halfway through this recounting. And I don't know what you think about it, but I think I'm getting a little bit better with the mapping pins and the latitudes and the longitudes and the position deductions. I must confess, when I started making the series, I had expected that it was going to be easier. Not because I think I'm an expert navigator, I haven't done a lot of aerial navigation. And it's actually 42 years since the last time I used a map and a compass and latitude, longitude, grid positions to navigate an aircraft over somewhere that I'd never been before. And that was from Sydney to Carcoar, well, Sydney to Blaney via Carcoar in a 3-seat Enstrom F-28C helicopter to go selling joyrides and barnstorming at the Carcoar Ben Hall Festival. So my apologies for the ham-fisted, clumsy efforts at translating latitudes and longitudes into map positions in the first probably 3 videos. They got a bit better by the 4th, and now I'm into the swing of it. I figured out how to do it. I don't think I'm too far wrong. And it's kind of interesting how much more sense plotting it with pins on a map makes than trying to convert list of figures like that in your head into a 3D picture of what's happening upon the curved surface of the Earth. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. I'm getting a bit of satisfaction out of persisting with it. I hope you're enjoying it. Ciao.